people live in this house. 8 people have experienced this. 8 people.
The evil here. Something I've felt before.
I
don't know how to protect you this time.
When we talk about The Conjuring, Last Rites, we are not simply discussing another installment in a horror franchise, but rather a cinematic piece that attempts to draw together years of myth, storytelling, character development, and real-world inspiration into one final, chilling chapter. Bio. To begin explaining this movie, it is essential to understand the weight of its position within the Conjuring universe. This is not just a random case file of Ed and Lorraine Warren. It is, as the title suggests, the Last Rites, a phrase that carries multiple connotations in Catholic tradition. In the Church, the last rites are prayers given to those at the threshold of death, meant to prepare the soul for its journey. The use of this phrase immediately signals to audiences that the film is about endings, about closure, and about the ultimate confrontation with mortality and evil. From the opening scene, the tone is darker, heavier, and more foreboding than its predecessors. Unlike The Conjuring 2013 or The Conjuring 2 2016, which began with haunting setups in domestic or community spaces, this film begins with the aura of ritual and inevitability. The audience is not invited to watch a haunting unfold, but rather to witness a reckoning, as though the universe of the Warrens is being prepared for its own final exorcism. What sets this first act apart is its immediate focus on Lorraine Warren's visions. In earlier films, her psychic gift was introduced as a frightening but useful tool, allowing the Warrens to connect with the spiritual world. Here, however, her visions are not simply glimpses of haunted entities, but are overwhelming, relentless floods of imagery that threaten to unravel her sanity. The filmmakers deliberately magnify these experiences with intense sound design and claustrophobic visuals. Instead of cleanly showing ghosts or spirits, they use fragmented hallucinations. Hands reaching out of darkness, crucifixes melting in candlelight, faces morphing between innocence and evil. This disorientation reflects Lorraine's inner turmoil. Her gift is no longer just a pathway to solving cases. It is becoming her personal curse. As the audience, we feel her dread not as passive observers, but as participants forced into the chaotic fragments of her second sight. At the same time, Ed Warren's role is given new depth in this opening movement. Traditionally portrayed as the strong, steady partner, the believer who grounds Lorraine's fragile spiritual sensitivities, Ed is here shown as deeply human and physically weakened. His past heart issues, hinted at in The Conjuring 2, become more prominent, showing us a man who is still determined to protect his wife, but is keenly aware of his own limitations. The juxtaposition of Lorraine's overbearing visions and Ed's vulnerable health creates a tension that underpins the entire narrative. How can two mortals, worn down by years of battling darkness, hope to stand against a force described as the embodiment of unholy power? This is not just about solving a haunting. It is about survival, legacy, and the ultimate test of their love. The plot's foundation is introduced here. The Warrens are called upon by the church to investigate a demonic presence that has resisted multiple exorcisms over centuries. Unlike earlier films that grounded their stories in family homes or cursed objects, this entity is tied directly to ritual, blasphemy, and sacramental corruption. By beginning in the realm of church rituals and theological dread, the film establishes itself as the most theologically loaded entry in the franchise. It is not about fear lurking in the shadows of bedrooms. It is about fear standing at the altar, desecrating faith itself. This framing elevates the stakes beyond personal terror into cosmic significance. Finally, in this first stretch of the film, symbolism is carefully planted. The filmmakers emphasize recurring images of candles extinguished abruptly by unseen forces and rosaries breaking apart in moments of tension. These motifs remind us that in this narrative, evil is not only powerful but invasive, constantly intruding into the sacred. The very tools of faith usually portrayed as protective are tested, twisted, and sometimes rendered useless in the face of overwhelming demonic influence. For audiences, this creates a sense of dread that is not confined to haunted house logic, but bleeds into larger questions of spiritual security. If even holy ground can be corrupted, then where is safe? And if the Warrens themselves, the paragons of resilience in this franchise, are showing cracks in their armor, what hope remains for ordinary believers? Thus, the explanation of The Conjuring. Last Rites begins not with spectacle, but with atmosphere, with a sense of creeping inevitability that prepares the audience for the grimmest journey yet in the saga of Ed and Lorraine Warren. As the film progresses into its second major movement, the narrative begins to broaden beyond the intimate focus on Ed and Lorraine and sets up the environment where their battle will take place. In traditional Conjuring fashion, the story introduces a family or a community affected by the haunting, but in Last Rites, the stakes are significantly higher. Instead of centering on a single household, the curse at the core of this film extends its shadow across a parish community that has suffered repeated tragedies, all linked to failed exorcisms in its history. This deliberate expansion of the haunting scope creates a wider canvas for the horror, one that allows the filmmakers to explore not only the terror of supernatural phenomena, but also the collective fear of a religious community questioning its faith. Unlike the Perron family in The Conjuring or the Hodgsons in The Conjuring 2, who represented isolated cases, the parish here symbolizes an entire body of believers who are shaken to the core by the persistence of evil. This wider scope gives the film an epic, almost apocalyptic flavor, as though the Warrens are not just investigating a haunting, but standing at the front lines of a spiritual war threatening to consume multiple generations. One of the most striking storytelling choices in this section is how the narrative deals with history. Through documents, testimonies, and visions, Lorraine uncovers that the demon they are facing has not merely attached itself to an individual, but has woven itself into the very timeline of the parish. We see that priests over the centuries attempted exorcisms, yet all failed, leaving behind not just victims, but also lingering doubt in the institution of the church itself. The film plays with the idea that evil, if not completely vanquished, leaves stains that ripple across time. This continuity of suffering stretching across decades and even centuries underscores the weight of the Warrens' mission. They are not merely stepping into one case, but into a legacy of defeat, where every previous attempt at salvation has ended in catastrophe. By situating the haunting within a historical continuum, the film deepens its mythology, reminding audiences that the universe of The Conjuring is not episodic but cumulative. Each battle is part of a larger war. Visually, this historical layering is conveyed through a blend of archival imagery and Lorraine's visions. The cinematography shifts between sepia-toned reenactments of past rituals gone wrong and stark, present-day sequences of parishioners tormented by apparitions. This interplay between past and present reinforces the sense that the demon is not constrained by time. It is a force that transcends eras, resurfacing whenever faith grows weak. The use of Lorraine as the narrative's medium ensures that history is not presented as static exposition, but as visceral, terrifying experience. When she walks through the church corridors, she doesn't just see the present, she sees priests dragged into shadows, altars desecrated, and parishioners screaming in centuries-old echoes. This merging of timelines transforms the haunting from a singular event into a perpetual cycle, suggesting that, unless the Warrens succeed, the curse will continue endlessly. This section of the film also explores the psychological toll on the parish community. Unlike the tightly knit family units of earlier installments, here we see a fractured body of believers. Some cling desperately to rituals, convinced that another round of prayers or exorcisms will finally work, while others abandon faith altogether, viewing the church as powerless against the encroaching darkness. This division within the community serves as a mirror to the central theme of doubt versus belief. The Warrens, though outsiders, must navigate this fragile landscape carefully, aware that every action they take either restores or further erodes the parish's faith. The dynamic between faith and skepticism, always present in the franchise, feels more urgent here because it is not about convincing a single mother or child to believe, but about rekindling the confidence of an entire congregation. At the same time, the filmmakers take care to remind us that the demon is not content to operate in the shadows. Unlike earlier hauntings where entities built suspense by slowly revealing themselves, this entity is aggressive from the outset. Parishioners collapse during Mass, voices are heard echoing through the church even when it is empty, and sacred symbols are inverted with chilling precision. A particularly haunting sequence involves a crucifix bleeding during a baptism, transforming what should have been a joyous sacrament into a terrifying omen. These blasphemous manifestations emphasize the central motif of Last Rites, the corruption of the sacred. The demon is not merely haunting a space. It is desecrating faith itself, sending a message that no ritual is safe, no prayer untouched. For the Warrens, this intensifies the battle, because their weapons have always been faith, love, and ritual. And here, those very tools are being turned against them. Thus, the second phase of the explanation shows us that the Conjuring, Last Rites, does not content itself with repeating the haunted house template. Instead, it broadens its narrative to encompass entire histories and communities, embedding its horror in the corruption of faith and the collective doubt of believers. By doing so, it elevates the story from personal haunting to communal reckoning, making the threat not just about individual survival, but about the endurance of belief itself. From a narrative standpoint, this section of the film highlights the genius of the Conjuring franchise, its ability to merge supernatural spectacle with raw human vulnerability. Viewers are not only scared of the demon's power, but also terrified of what will happen if the Warrens themselves break under the pressure. This dual fear, of the supernatural and of human fragility, creates a richer horror experience than the typical haunted house formula. Moreover, it gives the story a sense of maturity. The Warrens are no longer portrayed as invincible ghost hunters. They are aging, worn, and deeply human, yet still willing to stand against darkness. That willingness, despite their fragility, is what makes them heroes. In conclusion, this third movement of The Conjuring, Last Rites, deepens the emotional and psychological stakes of the story. By showing the cracks in Ed and Lorraine's armor, health problems, visions of death, doubts in faith, the film builds a sense of inevitability. It is not just about whether they will succeed in exorcising the demon. It is about whether they can survive the battle intact, both physically and spiritually. This layering of personal weakness and cosmic evil ensures that the story feels not only terrifying but profoundly human, drawing viewers into the Warrens' most harrowing investigation yet. At this point in The Conjuring, Last Rites, the story transitions from the Warrens' private struggles to the direct confrontations with the demonic force inside the parish grounds, and this is where the narrative begins to blend horror spectacle with deeper philosophical undertones. The church setting is deliberately chosen because it serves not only as a physical battleground, but also as a symbolic space where faith, doubt, and desecration collide. Previous entries in the franchise often centered on private homes, small spaces that could be invaded by evil. But here, the horror deliberately creeps into the most sacred and communal environment possible, the house of God itself. By doing so, the film poses unsettling questions. If the altar, the crucifix, and the consecrated spaces of worship can be corrupted, then what refuge remains for the faithful? This choice amplifies the fear because it expands the scope of vulnerability from individuals and families to entire communities. The first major confrontation in the church is staged not as a straightforward exorcism, but as a gradual unraveling of order during what should have been a routine ritual. A priest attempting to bless a child suspected of possession is violently attacked by an unseen force in front of horrified parishioners. Lorraine experiences overlapping visions during this moment. In one, she sees the child screaming with demonic eyes, while in another she sees her own reflection in the holy water, distorted into something monstrous. The brilliance of this sequence lies in its refusal to provide clarity. The audience, like Lorraine, cannot fully trust what is real and what is illusion, which builds an atmosphere of dread where perception itself becomes unreliable. By destabilizing the boundaries between truth and vision, the filmmakers remind us that evil is most terrifying when it can make us doubt our own senses. This scene also marks an important shift in tone. Instead of hiding in shadows, the demon asserts itself boldly in the sacred environment, mocking the rituals designed to banish it. Candles erupt into unnatural flames, statues crack as though alive, and hymns sung by the choir distort into guttural growls. These sensory distortions attack not just the characters but also the audience, immersing us in a world where the ordinary markers of holiness are subverted. This isn't just horror, it's blasphemy visualized. The inversion of the sacred is one of the film's recurring motifs, and this sequence sets the template for how it will continue, by taking objects of comfort and turning them into instruments of fear. In the aftermath of this confrontation, the Warrens begin to investigate the deeper roots of the entity's power, Through old parish records, they discover that the church had once attempted a forbidden ritual, not sanctioned by Rome, to trap and contain the demon centuries earlier. This act of desperation explains why the parish is cursed. The ritual did not eliminate the evil, but rather tethered it to the site, ensuring that each generation would feel its presence. Here the film pivots toward the lore-heavy storytelling that fans of the franchise enjoy, where every haunting is tied not just to random malice, but to human actions, choices made in desperation that ripple into the present. Evil in the Conjuring universe rarely appears without cause. It is almost always invited, however unintentionally, and in Last Rites, the parish's legacy of desperation and secrecy becomes the root of its haunting. Thematically, this revelation reinforces one of the franchise's central lessons, that human error, especially in spiritual matters, can open the door for forces beyond comprehension. The failed ritual becomes a cautionary tale within the film, suggesting that even those tasked with protecting the faithful can falter, and their mistakes can condemn generations. It is a chilling reminder that the line between savior and sinner is thinner than we like to admit. The Warrens, in uncovering this history, must grapple not only with the demonic entity itself, but also with the failures of the very institution they are allied with. This creates a moral tension. How can they trust rituals and blessings when the church itself once attempted to manipulate them, only to unleash catastrophe? Whoa. By focusing on these revelations, the film expands its scope beyond jump scares and possessions into a meditation on legacy, corruption, and the consequences of human fallibility. It asks the audience to consider whether faith, when wielded improperly, can cause as much harm as good. For Ed and Lorraine, this becomes the crux of their investigation, to discern whether the tools they have relied upon their entire careers are still valid weapons, or whether they must find a new way to combat evil. The dread of this realization is as suffocating as the physical hauntings, because it threatens to strip them of the only weapons they have ever known: belief, ritual, and sacrifice. In summary, the fourth movement of The Conjuring, Last Rites, escalates the confrontation by situating the battle in the church itself, corrupting the sacred and revealing that the haunting is rooted not only in demonic malice, but also in human failure. By combining blasphemous imagery, unreliable visions, and historical revelations, the film constructs a narrative where horror is not simply about spectral threats, but about the very foundations of faith being shaken. It is here that the audience begins to grasp the full weight of the title Last Rites. It is not just a ritual for the dying, but a warning that even faith, if corrupted, can face its own death. With the historical roots of the haunting revealed, The Conjuring, Last Rites begins to deepen its exploration of what it means to confront an enemy that is both spiritual and psychological. At this stage, the Warrens are no longer just investigators piecing together clues. They are participants in a battle that feels predetermined, as if every step they take has been orchestrated by the demon itself. The story cleverly positions the entity not just as a random malevolent presence, but as a manipulator of fate, drawing the Warrens into scenarios designed to break their spirits. For Lorraine, this manifests as increasingly vivid visions where she cannot distinguish her own mind from the demon's influence. One particularly harrowing sequence depicts her standing inside the church during Mass, only to suddenly realize that everyone around her has demonic eyes and is whispering blasphemies directed at her. She screams and the vision collapses, leaving her isolated in the silent pews. The ambiguity of whether this is a hallucination, a psychic premonition, or an actual supernatural intrusion destabilizes both Lorraine and the audience. By constructing horror through this uncertainty, the filmmakers achieve something rare in modern cinema: fear not just of what is seen, but of what cannot be trusted. Ed, meanwhile, experiences his own form of attack, though his is rooted in the demon's strategy of exploiting his physical vulnerabilities. Where Lorraine is assaulted through visions, Ed is tested through endurance. His heart condition, long foreshadowed in earlier installments, becomes a constant source of tension. Every time he exerts himself, whether during an exorcism attempt or simply climbing the church's stone steps, the audience is left fearing not just the demon's next move, but the fragility of Ed's body. This blending of physical frailty with supernatural terror heightens suspense in a way that no amount of CGI creatures could. Horror becomes layered. The enemy is both invisible and internal, both otherworldly and biological. The demon doesn't need to strike Ed directly. It only needs to push him far enough that his own body betrays him. This theme resonates strongly with viewers because it reflects real-world anxieties about aging, mortality, and the inevitability of human weakness. The fifth act also introduces one of the film's most powerful motifs: mirrors. Throughout the parish, mirrors begin to play a prominent role, appearing cracked, fogged, or inexplicably misplaced. Lorraine repeatedly encounters her reflection behaving independently, often mouthing words she has not spoken. In one chilling scene, she touches the surface of a mirror only for her reflection to grip her hand tightly from the other side. These sequences are not merely visual gimmicks. They represent the theme of distorted identity, of the self being invaded and corrupted by forces beyond comprehension. Mirrors, traditionally associated with truth and clarity, become tools of deception. By perverting this symbol, the film taps into a primal fear that we cannot even trust our own image. For Lorraine, whose identity is already compromised by her psychic abilities, these mirror hauntings threaten to erase her sense of self entirely, making her wonder if she is the vessel the demon has been seeking all along. Parallel to Lorraine's torment, the film also explores how the parish community begins to unravel further. Fear spreads like a contagion, and the congregation divides into factions: those who cling to the Warrens for salvation and those who blame them for intensifying the evil. This societal fracture serves as a backdrop for the demon's true strategy. Division, evil, as depicted in Last Rites, thrives not merely on terror but on mistrust, suspicion, and betrayal. In one particularly tense exchange, a group of parishioners demand that the Warrens leave, accusing them of bringing chaos into the church. The accusation cuts deeply, for it echoes doubts the Warrens themselves quietly harbor. Are they helping, or are they only magnifying the darkness by giving it attention? This moment underscores one of the film's strongest philosophical questions: can good intentions ever unintentionally serve evil? Visually, the filmmakers enhance this theme of division by emphasizing spatial dynamics. The church, once depicted as a unified sacred space, is shown fractured. Candles flicker unevenly, pews stand broken, and stained glass windows splinter light into ominous patterns. These visual cues remind the audience that the environment itself is corrupted, a reflection of the community's disintegration. Even the sound design reinforces this, with choir hymns occasionally breaking into discordant notes as though unseen voices are mocking the congregation. By embedding horror not just in apparitions but in the very architecture of the parish, the film creates an all-encompassing sense of desecration. By the end of this section, the Warrens realize that they are not just fighting for the soul of the parish. They are fighting to maintain their own identities, their faith, and their relationship. The demon is revealed not only as a force of supernatural terror, but as a strategist whose greatest weapon is manipulation. Mirrors that reflect lies, visions that corrupt love, whispers that sow mistrust, these tools make the haunting feel less like an invasion from outside and more like a war fought in the fragile spaces of the human mind and heart. The terror of The Conjuring, Last Rites, is not limited to sudden frights. It is a slow erosion of certainty, of self, and of community. And it is in this erosion, more than in any single jump scare, that the true horror lies. At this stage of The Conjuring, Last Rites, the narrative sharpens its focus on the central antagonist, the demon itself, and how it interacts with the Warrens and the parish community. Unlike previous installments where the demonic presence is eventually given a distinct identity, such as Bathsheba in the first film or Valak in The Conjuring 2, this entity is portrayed with deliberate ambiguity. It is not neatly categorized with a name or origin, at least not at first. Instead, the film emphasizes its characteristics: a force that manipulates faith, corrupts rituals, and thrives in sacred spaces. By withholding a clear identity, the filmmakers give the demon an amorphous, unknowable quality which heightens the fear. Audiences and characters alike cannot prepare for or research it fully because it is presented as something beyond traditional classifications. In many ways, it becomes less a character and more an embodiment of corruption itself, a spiritual parasite that feeds on devotion and turns it into despair. This ambiguity becomes a major source of terror because it leaves both the Warrens and the priests assisting them without their usual tools. Normally, the Warrens enter a case with research connecting the present haunting to some documented spirit or demonic name. Here, however, every attempt to trace the entity's nature results in contradiction. Records from centuries past describe different manifestations. In one account, it appeared as a child whispering blasphemies. In another, as a faceless shadow spreading disease. In another still, as an overwhelming voice that drowned out prayer. This inconsistency makes it nearly impossible to categorize and, by extension, nearly impossible to defeat. The priests who join the Warrens voice this concern explicitly, warning that an enemy without a name is an enemy without boundaries. This statement resonates throughout the film because it touches on a primal human truth. Naming gives power, and without a name, fear is limitless. For Lorraine, this lack of clarity intensifies her psychic torment. Her visions no longer provide guidance, but instead disorient her further. When she attempts to read the church through her abilities, she sees endless layers of reality folding upon themselves. One vision shows her walking through the parish, only to suddenly see its destruction centuries into the future. Burned pews, shattered stained glass, and unrecognizable corpses. Yep. Another vision places her in the past, watching priests chant in desperate failed rituals. The overlapping of time periods creates an overwhelming sense of inevitability. The demon is not confined to one era, but exists outside of time itself, reappearing whenever weakness allows it entry. Lorraine begins to fear that her gift is not showing her the path to victory, but is instead trapping her in the demon's cyclical narrative of victory over faith. Her despair grows, and audiences are forced to ask a chilling question. What happens when the psychic meant to guide the battle begins to doubt her own mind? Meanwhile, Ed experiences increasingly physical manifestations of the demon's power. In one sequence, he is alone in the rectory studying old exorcism notes when the pages burst into flame without warning. He attempts to douse them, but the fire spreads unnaturally, circling him like a cage. As his chest tightens from the smoke and heat, the camera lingers on his face, sweat, fear, and pain all converging. Just when it seems he will succumb, the fire extinguishes instantly, leaving no trace of damage. This cruel game illustrates the demon's sadistic nature. It doesn't want Ed dead immediately. It wants him to suffer, to feel his fragility, to live with the constant dread of collapse. This deliberate psychological torture mirrors Lorraine's torment and reinforces the idea that the entity knows its enemies intimately, exploiting their deepest fears and weaknesses. What makes this stage of the film so effective is that the demon's presence is not over-explained. Too many horror films falter when they reveal too much of the antagonist, turning mystery into spectacle. Here, ambiguity is weaponized. The audience never knows whether an event is supernatural, psychological, or a blend of both. The Warrens themselves are left guessing, which makes their plight relatable. The two are lost in a fog of uncertainty, unsure of where reality ends and manipulation begins. This stylistic choice ensures that tension never dissipates. Even moments of silence feel threatening, because absence itself might be another form of attack. Thematically, the film begins to explore the idea that evil does not always need a face to be powerful. By presenting the demon as a corrupting force rather than a defined creature, Last Rites implies that evil is most terrifying when it is invisible, formless, and uncontainable. This ties directly into the larger message of the film. That darkness is not limited to haunted houses or cursed objects, but can inhabit spaces of trust, tradition, and even love. For the Warrens, this realization is devastating because it suggests that their previous victories may have been less about defeating evil and more about temporarily pushing it back. If evil cannot be named, categorized, or destroyed, then their life's work has been a series of postponements, not triumphs. By the close of this section, audiences are left with a growing sense of despair. The Warrens are not just dealing with a haunting, they are confronting the possibility that the battle against evil is endless, cyclical, and unwinnable. The demon's refusal to reveal itself, its constant manipulation of perception, and its sadistic targeting of their weaknesses all point toward a terrifying conclusion: that some forces are too vast to be conquered. This realization elevates The Conjuring, Last Rites, from being just another horror sequel into a meditation on the nature of evil itself. The fear here is existential, not just situational, and that is what makes this chapter stand out in the franchise. By the seventh movement of The Conjuring, Last Rites, the film begins to weave together its multiple threads: personal struggles, community collapse, and demonic ambiguity into an overwhelming crescendo of dread. What makes this stage of the story especially powerful is how the filmmakers orchestrate a sense of claustrophobia, not only through confined physical spaces, but also through the shrinking psychological options available to the Warrens and those around them. The parish, once depicted as a place of sanctuary, has by now become a prison of despair. Every attempt to restore order seems to backfire, and each ritual performed only strengthens the perception that evil is winning. The demon, through its refusal to be clearly defined, creates a battlefield where the defenders are constantly second-guessing themselves. It is a masterclass in horror design. Fear is not derived solely from what the audience sees, but from the sense that every action could be a trap. One of the most memorable sequences in this section involves the parish choir. After the initial attacks and growing tensions, the priest decides to gather the congregation in a unifying act of worship, hoping that a collective display of faith might repel the darkness. The choir begins to sing a hymn, soft, solemn, and intended to rekindle hope. At first, the scene carries a sense of calm, but then the sound begins to distort. Certain voices become deeper, guttural, out of sync. Slowly, the hymn transforms into an unholy chant, as though the demon is speaking through the voices of the faithful. Lorraine clutches her ears, overwhelmed, while Ed yells for the singing to stop, but the congregation is entranced, continuing until several collapse to the floor, unconscious. The scene is terrifying because it weaponizes community and worship, things normally associated with unity and safety, turning them into instruments of corruption. For the audience, it is a shocking moment that reinforces the film's central motif: nothing sacred is safe. In addition to these grand moments, the film also excels in smaller, intimate horrors that cut to the core of the character's psychology. Lorraine's visions become increasingly personal. She begins to see her daughter, Judy, in danger, even though Judy is physically far away. In one haunting vision, Judy is shown inside their Connecticut home, playing the piano, only for her reflection in the polished wood to reveal demonic features. Lorraine screams Judy's name, but when she blinks, the vision disappears, leaving her trembling and in tears. This scene is particularly poignant because it reminds the audience of the stakes beyond the immediate case. The Warrens are not just investigators. They are parents, a family vulnerable to the same evil they fight. By dragging Judy into Lorraine's visions, the film makes the horror not only professional but deeply personal, raising the emotional intensity to new heights. Ed, on the other hand, is haunted by his own version of intimate torment. In a disturbing dream sequence, he finds himself back at their home, walking into the basement where their collection of haunted artifacts is kept. At first, the scene seems like a memory, but then the objects begin to rattle violently. One by one, cursed relics break free of their cases. The Annabelle doll's glass shatters, music boxes wind themselves up, and crucifixes flip upside down. Ed realizes that every case he and Lorraine have ever solved has come back to haunt him, literally and figuratively. The dream crescendos when Annabelle whispers his name, her porcelain face cracking to reveal demonic fire inside. Ed wakes in a cold sweat, gasping for breath. This nightmare functions not just as a scare, but as a thematic reminder that their entire career has been a prolonged flirtation with death, with each case leaving behind scars that never fully heal. The demon is exploiting this truth, making Ed question whether he has doomed his family by dedicating his life to confronting evil. Another layer of tension is introduced through the clergy who assists the Warrens. The priests themselves begin to falter, some expressing doubt about whether they should continue. One elder priest warns that by engaging the demon directly, the Warrens risk not only their own lives, but also the spiritual safety of everyone connected to them. This moment reflects a recurring idea in the film, the possibility that the mere act of fighting evil might draw more evil into the world. For audiences, this sparks an unsettling reflection. Can resistance sometimes be complicit in spreading the very thing it opposes? Oh. The Warrens, of course, refuse to abandon the fight, but the doubt planted by these words continues to gnaw at them, particularly Lorraine. Visually, the film continues to intensify its oppressive tone. The church grows darker with light sources dwindling as if the building itself is being drained of life. Shadows stretch unnaturally, lingering even when the source of light is removed. The cinematography mirrors the characters' psychological states, fragmented, suffocated, and fragile. Every frame conveys the sense that the characters are being closed in upon, not just by walls, but by unseen forces. The sound design contributes to this effect with deep, low-frequency vibrations that audiences can almost feel in their chests, evoking the sensation of being trapped under an invisible weight. By the end of this section, it becomes clear that The Conjuring: Last Rites is not merely escalating toward a climactic exorcism. It is steadily stripping its characters of every certainty, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. Faith is corrupted, visions are unreliable, and even dreams provide no refuge. The Warrens, once depicted as heroic figures of resilience, are shown here as fragile humans caught in a storm far larger than themselves. This vulnerability does not weaken the film. It strengthens it, making the stakes feel not only supernatural but profoundly human. The demon's greatest power, we realize, is not in possession or poltergeist activity, but in eroding the very foundations of belief, love, and trust. That is the real terror, and the reason Last Rites earns its place as the most psychologically devastating entry in the franchise. By the 8th major development of The Conjuring, Last Rites, the narrative begins to transition from escalating horror to the formulation of a desperate plan, though even here the sense of hopelessness remains pervasive. At this point, the Warrens and their allies realize that traditional methods, holy water, scripture, blessings, are not having the desired effect. In fact, in several instances, these tools seem to make the demon stronger, as though it feeds off attempts to banish it. This inversion of expectation is deeply unsettling both for the characters and the audience, because it challenges the foundational belief that good will naturally overpower evil. The filmmakers drive this point home through multiple failed rituals that leave parishioners injured and the Warrens increasingly demoralized. What is usually the path to salvation in a Conjuring film, ritual exorcism, now becomes a catalyst for terror, suggesting that the entity is not only resisting, but actively consuming the energy directed against it. A pivotal scene in this section involves the church's altar. Believing it to be the spiritual heart of the parish, the priests and the Warrens attempt to sanctify it anew, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers. For a moment, the air grows calm and hope flickers. But then the marble altar begins to crack, blood seeping from within as though the church itself were bleeding. The sight is grotesque and symbolic, a visual declaration that the sacred has been hollowed out from the inside. Parishioners scream, some faint, and others accuse the Warrens of provoking the desecration. The sequence encapsulates the central theme of this installment: the terrifying possibility that evil does not always exist on the periphery of holiness, but can corrupt it from within. This idea unsettles viewers far more than any jump scare could because it undermines the very notion of sanctuary. If even the altar bleeds, then where is safety to be found? Lorraine's visions during this stage become increasingly entangled with the demon's manipulations to the point where she begins to lose her sense of agency. In one harrowing vision, she finds herself reliving her wedding day with Ed, walking down the aisle in radiant white. But halfway through the ceremony, she looks to the priest and sees not a human face, but the gaping maw of the demon. The congregation transforms into shadowy figures, whispering profanities, and Ed himself collapses at the altar, his chest torn open. Lorraine screams and collapses, awakening back in the parish hall, drenched in sweat and tears. The emotional toll of this vision is immense because it weaponizes one of her most cherished memories, corrupting it beyond recognition. For audiences, it demonstrates the demon's capacity not only to torment through fear of death, but also through the defilement of love and memory, stripping away the foundations of Lorraine's strength. Meanwhile, Ed's condition continues to worsen both physically and emotionally. His heart troubles are exacerbated by constant stress, and the demon seems to exploit this weakness with surgical precision. In one chilling moment, he feels a sharp pain in his chest during a confrontation and collapses to the ground, gasping. Lorraine rushes to his side only to find his pulse faltering. Just as she prepares to perform CPR, Ed's eyes snap open, but they are not his own. They glow with a malevolent fire as the demon momentarily takes control. Using Edie's body as a puppet, it whispers threats into Lorraine's ear. You cannot save him. You cannot save yourself. Moments later, the possession ends, leaving Ed traumatized and disoriented. This sequence is terrifying not only because it shows the demon's ability to infiltrate Ed, but also because it uses his frailty as an entry point. Evil here is not portrayed as an overwhelming external force, but as an opportunist exploiting cracks in the human vessel. The supporting priests and parishioners by this point are fractured beyond repair. Some cling desperately to faith, continuing to chant prayers despite their apparent ineffectiveness, while others outright abandon the fight, leaving the church altogether. This fragmentation reflects the demon's triumph on a societal level. Its strategy is not to annihilate outright, but to divide, weaken, and spread mistrust. The filmmakers highlight this through small but potent interactions. A parishioner refusing to sit next to another, whispers of betrayal in the pews, accusations that the Warrens are frauds. The church, once a unified body, now mirrors the chaos of a battlefield where allies turn against one another. From a technical perspective, the cinematography emphasizes the theme of collapse through increasingly unbalanced visuals. Shots become tilted, camera movements disjointed, and editing rhythms erratic, reflecting the breakdown of order. Even the color palette shifts noticeably, moving from candlelit golds to sickly greens and oppressive blacks. This visual descent mirrors the character's psychological unraveling, reinforcing the sensation that the audience, too, is being dragged deeper into darkness. By the close of this section, the Warrens are left with a single chilling realization. Conventional tools of faith are insufficient. If they are to survive this encounter, they must confront the demon on its own terms, delving into uncharted spiritual and psychological territory. This revelation does not come as a triumphant moment, but as a reluctant acceptance of necessity. It foreshadows the film's eventual climax while leaving the audience steeped in dread, for the implication is that the Warrens may have to sacrifice parts of themselves, perhaps even their souls, to stand any chance of victory. At this point, The Conjuring, Last Rites has firmly established itself not just as another installment in a horror franchise, but as a meditation on the fragility of faith, love, and identity when confronted by unrelenting evil. By the 9th stage of The Conjuring, Last Rites, the story begins to dive deeper into the metaphysical core of its narrative. Up to this point, the haunting has been primarily depicted through physical manifestations, visions, and corrupted rituals. Now, however, the film pivots toward exploring the very nature of evil itself, suggesting that the entity afflicting the parish is less a discrete demon and more a metaphysical principle, an embodiment of despair, faithlessness, and decay. This conceptual shift is crucial because it reframes the struggle not as a battle against a singular villain, but as a confrontation with the inevitability of corruption. By broadening the scope in this way, the filmmakers elevate the story beyond traditional horror tropes, transforming it into something that feels almost theological in weight. For the Warrens, this revelation is terrifying because it suggests that they are not fighting something that can be banished. They are struggling against an eternal, universal force that has no end. Lorraine is the first to intuit this shift, though her insights come at a heavy price. Her visions intensify to the point of nearly driving her into psychosis. One extended sequence shows her standing before a seemingly endless mirror, each reflection displaying a different version of herself. A faithful wife, a grieving widow, a corpse, a possessed monster. The reflections speak in unison, telling her that no matter which version she becomes, the outcome is always the same. Ed dies, she suffers, and the demon wins. This nightmarish vision is among the film's most unsettling, not because of gore or violence, but because of its philosophical weight. It suggests that fate itself has been corrupted. For Lorraine, whose psychic ability has often been her guide, this realization feels like betrayal by her own gift. She begins to fear that her visions are not warnings but manipulations designed to funnel her toward despair. Ed's experience mirrors this existential dread in his own way. Physically weaker than ever, he becomes increasingly dependent on Lorraine, which the demon exploits mercilessly. In one sequence, Ed is left alone in the church for only a few minutes, during which he hears the sound of Lorraine's voice calling for help. He rushes through the dark hallways, only to discover her lying on the ground, lifeless. As he cradles her body, the camera lingers cruelly on his anguish until the body dissolves into smoke and the real Lorraine appears behind him, horrified by what he has just endured. The demon is not only tormenting Ed through fear of his own mortality, but also through the weaponization of his love for Lorraine. For the audience, this scene is devastating because it demonstrates that the bond which has always been the Warrens' greatest strength is now the very weapon being used against them. The parishioners, meanwhile, serve as a grim chorus to the Warrens' suffering. Many have abandoned the church entirely, while those who remain are divided into camps of fanaticism and despair. One small group insists on doubling down, performing dangerous rituals without guidance, often harming themselves in the process. Another group resigns themselves to the belief that the parish is cursed beyond repair, retreating into silence and apathy. The demon's triumph lies not in mass destruction, but in this quiet, creeping disintegration of community. Evil here is not loud but insidious, manifesting in the breakdown of trust, solidarity, and shared belief. For audiences, this is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the film. The recognition that true horror is not always external but social, found in the spaces where unity should exist. Cinematically, the filmmakers reinforce these ideas through imagery that borders on surrealism. Shadows on the walls no longer behave naturally. They slither and contort even when characters are still. Candle flames burn black instead of gold, and the stained glass windows, once vibrant, begin to lose their color, as though the life is being drained from them. These subtle yet haunting details create an atmosphere of cosmic wrongness, reminding viewers that what they are witnessing is not just a haunting, but a collapse of spiritual order. The sound design amplifies this sense of wrongness with whispers layered so densely in the background that audiences struggle to discern words. Sometimes the whispers resolve into recognizable blasphemies, but more often they remain indecipherable, leaving the impression of meaning just beyond reach, an auditory metaphor for the ineffable nature of evil itself. At this point in the narrative, the Warrens confront their darkest doubts. Lorraine begins to wonder whether her gift is truly a blessing or if it has always been a curse, a direct line that allows evil to invade her mind. Ed, for his part, wrestles with the fear that his failing body is not only a liability, but a doorway for possession. Their conversations during this section are raw and emotional, stripped of the confidence they once displayed in earlier films. They admit their fears to each other in whispered exchanges, and these moments of vulnerability ground the supernatural chaos in deeply human emotion. For all its demons and visions, the film never loses sight of its emotional heart, the bond between Ed and Lorraine, fragile yet enduring. By the close of this section, the Warrens reach a devastating conclusion. If the entity they are fighting is not a demon with a name, but an embodiment of corruption itself, then no ritual will suffice. They realize that their only hope may lie not in trying to banish it, but in confronting it directly, offering themselves as vessels to draw its full attention. This is a horrifying prospect, because it risks not only their lives, but their souls. And yet the film makes it clear that this is the path they are being driven toward, willingly or not. The audience is left with an overwhelming sense of dread, knowing that whatever comes next will demand the ultimate sacrifice. By the 10th major turning point of The Conjuring, Last Rites, the story pivots into its most harrowing psychological territory, as the Warrens prepare for what they begin to suspect may be their final confrontation with the entity. Up to this point, the haunting has progressively eroded their faith in their methods, their visions, and even their relationship. Now, the demon intensifies its assault by focusing on the single greatest weapon the Warrens have always carried, their love for one another. In the previous films, this love was their shield, the emotional anchor that allowed them to endure trials that would have broken lesser investigators. But here, in a cruel inversion, love itself becomes the battlefield. The demon begins to twist their affection into fear, doubt, and despair, crafting illusions and manipulations that pit their devotion against their survival. This thematic inversion is not only narratively compelling but also deeply unsettling, because it suggests that no human bond, however sacred, is immune to corruption. The centerpiece of this section is a sequence often described by early reviewers as one of the most disturbing in the entire Conjuring franchise. Lorraine, already weakened by visions, finds herself standing at the altar during what appears to be a normal Sunday Mass. The church is filled with light, the congregation singing joyfully, and Ed at her side. For a brief moment, she feels peace, the kind of serenity she has not known since the haunting began. But as the choir swells, she turns to look at Ed, only to see blood pouring from his eyes and mouth. The congregation continues to sing, their voices morphing into demonic growls as Ed collapses beside her. Lorraine screams, trying to revive him, but when she looks up, the priest officiating the Mass has transformed into a monstrous figure, his face stretched and torn, chanting in Latin reversed. The entire church dissolves into ash around her, leaving her alone in a barren wasteland. This vision, lasting several minutes, is a masterpiece of horror filmmaking because it blends serenity with sudden desecration, joy with anguish, and love with despair. For Lorraine, the vision leaves her broken, unable to distinguish truth from deception. For the audience, it cements the demon's sadistic genius. It does not merely kill or frighten, it desecrates what is most beloved. Ed's torment during this stage is no less harrowing. His deteriorating health is exploited mercilessly, with the demon forcing him to confront his greatest fear, that he will not live long enough to protect Lorraine. In one scene, Ed finds himself in a dreamlike vision of a hospital room where he is strapped to a bed, unable to move. Machines beep ominously, doctors murmur prayers, and Lorraine stands at his side, weeping. But when he calls out to her, she turns her head, revealing empty sockets where her eyes should be. The camera lingers on Ed's horror as Lorraine, now faceless, whispers, "You failed me." The dream ends abruptly, but its impact lingers. Ed awakens in tears, his heart pounding, clutching his chest. This sequence does more than frighten. It amplifies the emotional weight of the story, forcing audiences to share Ed's terror of failure and mortality. The parish itself continues to unravel in parallel to the Warrens' suffering. What began as a frightened but united community has now devolved into suspicion, blame, and violence. Parishioners accuse one another of inviting the demon, while others engage in desperate, misguided rituals. One young man even attempts self-flagellation in the belief that personal sacrifice will drive the evil away, only to collapse from blood loss. This descent into fanaticism mirrors historical accounts of communities gripped by hysteria, and the filmmakers draw heavily on such imagery to reinforce the idea that evil's greatest triumph lies in turning people against themselves. The church, once a symbol of sanctuary, now resembles a battlefield littered with human weakness and despair. The cinematography of this section emphasizes fragmentation. Scenes are shot with jagged cuts lingering on distorted angles, as though the very camera has become possessed. Lighting becomes increasingly unreliable. Candles flicker violently, sometimes extinguishing entirely, leaving moments of complete darkness where the audience hears whispers but sees nothing. The use of sound here is particularly masterful. Rather than bombarding the audience with constant noise, the film employs silence punctuated by sudden bursts of distorted chants, creating an unpredictable rhythm that keeps viewers on edge. This audiovisual disorientation mirrors the Warrens' psychological breakdown, making the audience feel complicit in their terror. Perhaps the most powerful element of this stage, however, is the way it frames the Warrens' love not as an unshakable shield, but as a potential liability. Their bond, once their salvation, is now the very thing the demon exploits to torment them most effectively. This inversion raises profound philosophical questions. If even love can be weaponized, then what hope remains for humanity? The film does not offer easy answers, and that ambiguity is part of its strength. Instead, it forces viewers to wrestle with the possibility that love and faith, while powerful, are fragile, and that evil can twist them into instruments of suffering. By the conclusion of this section, the Warrens come to a chilling realization. The demon is not trying to defeat them through brute force, but through corruption. Its strategy is not destruction but desecration, not chaos but manipulation. This understanding reframes the conflict entirely. They are not simply exorcists battling a malevolent spirit. It is a revelation that sets the stage for the climax while leaving both characters and audience steeped in existential dread. By the 11th stage of The Conjuring, Last Rites, the story transitions from relentless psychological assaults to a fragile attempt at strategy, though even this is saturated with dread and uncertainty. After enduring endless visions, failed rituals, and escalating despair, Ed and Lorraine realize that survival requires more than blind resistance. It requires insight into the nature of the entity itself. But insight in this case is not knowledge that brings clarity. It is knowledge that deepens horror. The priests and scholars assisting the Warrens begin poring over obscure texts, piecing together fragments of lore about entities that thrive not by direct possession, but by corruption of sacred spaces. These records describe creatures that do not reveal names because names would impose limitations. Instead, they are parasites of the holy sustained by desecrating rituals and faith. This new understanding does not empower the Warrens. Rather, it leaves them with the terrible realization that they are not facing an anomaly, but a recurring cosmic phenomenon, something that has plagued the faithful across centuries, appearing wherever devotion is strongest. Evil in this framework is not a mistake or invasion, but an inevitable shadow of holiness. This revelation strikes Lorraine with particular force. Her visions confirm what the texts suggest, showing her flashes of monks in medieval Europe desperately chanting prayers while their abbeys burned around them. She sees nuns in plague-ridden convents, their prayers swallowed by mocking laughter that echoes through time. Each vision reinforces the notion that this demon or force has been present for centuries, rising whenever communities attempt to sanctify a place of worship too zealously. In other words, the very act of creating sacred spaces invites its opposite, a counterforce that feeds on the attempt at holiness. This philosophical horror shakes Lorraine to her core. If every prayer risks attracting corruption, then what is the meaning of devotion? Her psychic gift, once a beacon of guidance, now serves only to drag her deeper into despair as she is forced to confront humanity's cyclical vulnerability to evil. Ed, though less connected to visions, feels the weight of this revelation as well. His practical mind struggles with the idea that evil might be eternal, invulnerable, and undefeatable. For a man whose life has been built on the notion that every haunting can be resolved with faith and determination, this new knowledge threatens to break him. So, in one emotionally charged scene, Ed argues with a priest who suggests that perhaps the only true defense against such an entity is withdrawal, abandoning the parish, leaving it as a monument to corruption, and seeking new ground. Ed rejects this, furious, insisting that surrender would be the ultimate victory for evil. Yet his anger is undercut by his frailty. Midway through his outburst, he clutches his chest, gasping for breath. Lorraine rushes to steady him, her face torn between fear for his health and fear of the truth they are uncovering. This moment underscores the film's central tension. Fighting evil may be noble, but it may also be self-destructive, consuming those who stand against it. The parishioner's role during this stage highlights the corrosive effect of hopelessness. With each failed ritual and each new manifestation of corruption, the congregation fractures further. A small faction continues to trust the Warrens, clinging to the idea that perseverance will eventually drive the demon out. Another faction grows hostile, accusing the Warrens of inviting the evil, demanding that they leave before the entire parish is destroyed. Still others retreat into apathy, sitting silently in the pews with blank expressions as if hollowed out by despair. These divisions echo the broader theme of the film. Evil does not need to slay its victims to win. It only needs to break their will to resist. The social disintegration within the parish becomes a mirror of the Warrens' personal struggles, both arenas reflecting the same truth, that corruption spreads through division and despair rather than brute force. From a technical perspective, the filmmakers heighten this sense of unraveling with visuals that deliberately blur the line between reality and vision. Windows show landscapes that do not match the outside world, sometimes depicting barren wastelands or burning cities. Statues of saints subtly shift their gazes, leaving audiences uncertain whether they truly moved or if it was an illusion. These details are not accompanied by musical stings or dramatic reveals. They linger quietly in the background, instilling unease through suggestion rather than spectacle. This restraint reinforces the idea that the horror is omnipresent, subtle, and corrosive rather than flashy or overt. The audience, like the characters, cannot trust what they see, and this mistrust becomes a form of psychological imprisonment. Perhaps the most haunting development of this stage is Lorraine's growing suspicion that the demon's true aim is not to claim the parish, but to claim her. The visions become increasingly personalized, focusing on her fears, her memories, and her love for Ed. She begins to question whether the entire haunting has been orchestrated not around the church, but around her presence within it. If this is true, then every parishioner, every priest, every act of desecration has been part of a larger strategy to isolate and break her. The audience shares in this dread because the evidence is compelling. Her visions are always central, her despair the deepest, her bond with Ed the most targeted. The possibility that Lorraine herself is the intended vessel of corruption raises the stakes to a terrifying new level, setting the stage for the film's climactic developments. By the end of this section, the Warrens stand at the brink of despair. Their tools have failed, their faith has been shaken, and their love has been weaponized against them. Yet amid the darkness, a grim resolve begins to take shape. If they cannot banish the entity through traditional means, they must consider unorthodox methods, even if those methods demand sacrifice. The tension at this point is unbearable because the audience knows that the climax will not be about triumph in the traditional sense, but about endurance, sacrifice, and the possibility of loss. In this way, The Conjuring, Last Rites continues to distinguish itself from its predecessors, not by offering hope, but by plunging fearlessly into the abyss of uncertainty and despair. By the 12th stage of The Conjuring, Last Rites, the film reaches a point where the narrative's psychological horror merges with ritualistic desperation. The Warrens, having realized that traditional methods of exorcism fail against this entity, reluctantly agree to attempt something radical, an inversion of the rites themselves. This desperate plan is born not out of confidence but necessity. If the demon feeds on faith and ritual, then perhaps the only way to weaken it is to deny it the satisfaction of corruption. Instead of channeling holy energy directly against it, the Warrens consider embracing silent stillness and non-resistance, an approach antithetical to every lesson they have learned. This notion terrifies them because it requires vulnerability rather than power and trust rather than command. For Ed and Lorraine, who have always approached hauntings with active defense, the idea of standing exposed before evil without invoking their arsenal of sacred tools feels like inviting death. Yet paradoxically, this is what makes the plan worth trying, because all other strategies have only strengthened the entity. The build-up to this experiment is drenched in tension. The Warrens and the few priests who still stand with them prepare the church, not by fortifying it with relics and blessings, but by stripping it of all protective symbols. Candles are extinguished, crosses removed, scripture silenced. The church is left barren, its emptiness a stark contrast to the heavy ornamentation of earlier scenes. This visual choice is both unsettling and symbolic. By removing the sacred, the Warrens hope to remove the fuel on which the demon thrives. Yet the sight of a stripped, silent parish hall feels more blasphemous than anything the demon has done. It is a desecration by omission, a space where holiness has been intentionally withdrawn. For the audience, this inversion of ritual is deeply disturbing because it challenges the comforting idea that sacred symbols are always sources of strength. Here, strength lies in abandoning them, creating an atmosphere of existential dread. Lorraine's role in this experiment is central. She is instructed to enter a meditative state, opening herself fully to her visions, but without resisting or interpreting them. The goal is not to fight the demon, but to observe it, to let it reveal its true nature without interference. This act requires immense courage because Lorraine has already been driven to the brink of collapse by her visions. Now she must willingly surrender herself to them, trusting that by offering no resistance, she might deny the demon the satisfaction of manipulation. The sequence that follows is one of the most harrowing in the film. Lorraine enters a trance, seated in the center of the empty church, her eyes closed as Ed clutches her hand. The camera lingers on her trembling face as shadows creep across the walls, whispers grow louder, and the temperature drops. When she opens her eyes, the church is gone. She finds herself in a void, surrounded by countless faceless figures chanting her name. They approach, their voices growing louder until she collapses to her knees. Ed, watching helplessly, can see her body convulsing, sweat pouring down her face. He whispers her name, begging her to return, but the priests hold him back, warning that interference could doom the ritual. These moments are deeply unsettling because they reflect historical witch trials and mass hysteria, showing how quickly communities under duress can turn on their most vulnerable. The demon's presence thus functions less as an external invader and more as a catalyst for humanity's darkest instincts, revealing that evil's most effective weapon is not possession but manipulation of fear. Cinematically, this stage of the film is remarkable for its oppressive use of silence. Rather than bombarding the audience with constant supernatural noise, the filmmakers often allow long stretches of near-total quiet, broken only by the sound of footsteps, ragged breathing, or faint whispers. This creates an atmosphere where every small noise feels loaded with menace, keeping viewers in a constant state of dread. The visuals mirror this restraint. Lingering shots of empty hallways, doors slightly ajar, or flickering candles convey far more terror than overt manifestations. It is horror through absence, a masterful technique that underscores the film's theme of erosion rather than explosion. At the center of it all is the relationship between Ed and Lorraine, which by this point is pushed to its breaking point. Their love has been the core of the entire Conjuring franchise, a source of strength in the face of darkness. Yet here, that love is weaponized so effectively that even moments of tenderness are tinged with dread. When Ed comforts Lorraine, she fears it may not be him, but a mimic. When Lorraine leans on Ed, he fears his weakness may cause him to fail her. Every embrace, every whispered reassurance becomes a potential trap, as though intimacy itself has been poisoned. The audience, deeply invested in their bond, feels this strain acutely, making the film's horror not only supernatural but profoundly emotional. The priests, realizing that their authority has little effect, become desperate, turning to obscure texts and forgotten rites in hopes of finding a solution. Yet these attempts often backfire, producing grotesque phenomena that further terrify the parish. In one chilling sequence, a priest attempts an ancient incantation, only for the altar to crack open, spilling black sludge that reeks of decay. The congregation flees in terror, convinced the church itself has been claimed by evil. This scene reinforces the sense that every attempt at resistance only strengthens the demon, deepening the futility that pervades the film. By the conclusion of this stage, the sense of inevitability is overwhelming. Lorraine is barely holding on to sanity, Ed is physically crumbling, the parish is consumed by paranoia, and the priests are out of options. The church no longer feels like a battleground where victory is possible, but like a stage where the slow destruction of faith is being performed with cruel precision. The demon, though rarely visible, dominates every frame through its influence, reminding the audience that evil does not always need to strike directly to win. It can simply wait as hope withers. This 14th paragraph thus cements the film's transformation from a story of exorcism into a meditation on despair, corruption, and the fragility of human bonds in the face of relentless darkness. By the 15th stage of The Conjuring, Last Rites, the narrative shifts from depicting mere suffering to exploring the terrifying cost of endurance. The Warrens, the parish, and the priests have been stripped of nearly every tool, every certainty, and every shred of security. What remains is not faith in ritual or confidence in power, but the fragile persistence of human will, the determination to stand even when there is no reason to believe survival is possible. It is here that the film's themes crystallize most powerfully, presenting horror not as a battle to be won, but as a crucible in which meaning itself is tested. Viewers are no longer watching a haunted church. They are witnessing a meditation on the fragility of love, faith, and sanity when confronted with forces designed to unmake them. Lorraine's visions at this stage become paradoxical, offering not only torment but glimpses of clarity. She begins to realize that the faceless figures are not random illusions, but fragments of the demon's essence, masks that hide its true identity. Yet with every attempt to see through them, she risks greater psychological collapse. In one particularly haunting sequence, she walks through the church at night, guided only by moonlight filtering through broken windows. Everywhere she looks, the faceless figures stand silently, lined along the pews, crowded in the aisles, looming at the altar. At first she trembles, overwhelmed by their sheer number. But as she forces herself to look closer, she notices that they are not entirely faceless after all. Beneath the blank surfaces, faint impressions of eyes, mouths, and features flicker as though the demon has drawn fragments of every soul it has ever corrupted. The realization horrifies her. These are not mere illusions, but echoes of countless victims across history, absorbed into its essence. Ed, too, begins to experience visions, though his are less vivid than Lorraine's. His deteriorating health leaves him drifting in and out of consciousness, and in those half-conscious states, he hears whispers calling his name. At first, he dismisses them as dreams, but soon they grow more insistent, urging him to surrender, promising him peace if he lets go. In one harrowing moment, he awakens to find himself standing in the middle of the church with no memory of how he got there, holding a rosary that is twisted into a loop of barbed wire. Blood drips from his hand where the wire has cut his skin. This scene conveys the demon's increasing grip not only on Lorraine but on Ed as well, threatening to break the couple entirely. The parishioners continue their descent into madness. Trust has eroded completely, and families barricade themselves in different parts of the church, refusing to speak or share food with others. The once unified congregation is now a collection of isolated, terrified individuals, each convinced the others are tainted. This fracturing mirrors the Warrens' internal struggles and underscores the central theme. Evil does not need to slaughter communities to destroy them. It only needs to isolate them, eroding the bonds that give them strength. The film captures this with quiet, devastating images, parents clutching their children in dark corners, priests arguing over the interpretation of scripture, elderly parishioners staring blankly at walls as though waiting for the end. Cinematically, the 15th stage employs oppressive stillness punctuated by sudden, jarring intrusions. Long shots of silent, unmoving spaces are shattered by brief, violent imagery. A shadow darting across the wall, a candle exploding into sparks, a crucifix falling and splintering. These shocks are not used for cheap scares, but to reinforce the sense that stability itself has collapsed, that every moment of quiet is merely the calm before another intrusion. The audience, by this point, is conditioned to expect horror not at predictable beats, but at moments of vulnerability, mirroring the character's inability to ever feel safe. The Warrens' relationship, already frayed, begins to show cracks that feel irrevocable. In a moment of despair, Ed admits to Lorraine that he fears he has become a burden, that his failing body is holding her back from confronting the demon fully. Lorraine, enraged and heartbroken, insists that his presence is her only anchor, that without him, she would already be lost. The argument escalates into shouting, their love briefly consumed by the very fear and doubt the demon has nurtured all along. Though they reconcile, the damage lingers, a reminder that even the strongest bonds can be bent under relentless pressure. This emotional realism deepens the horror, grounding supernatural terror in human vulnerability. The priests, desperate for answers, turn to Lorraine for guidance, urging her to use her visions to uncover the demon's name. But Lorraine refuses, recognizing the danger of giving it further attention. She insists that naming the entity will not banish it, but empower it, cementing its hold on the parish. This refusal creates further conflict, with some priests accusing her of cowardice and others begging her to reconsider. The debate underscores one of the film's most chilling implications. Knowledge itself can be a form of corruption. To know too much about evil is to risk being consumed by it. By the end of this stage, the situation has deteriorated into near hopelessness. Lorraine is tormented by visions of endless victims. Ed teeters on the brink of collapse. The parish is fractured beyond repair, and the priests are paralyzed by disagreement. Yet within this despair lies the faintest glimmer of resolve. Lorraine, shaken but unbroken, declares that if the demon seeks to corrupt love, then love itself must be the weapon they wield. It is not a confident declaration, but a desperate one, uttered through tears as she clings to Ed. Still, it sets the trajectory for the climax, framing the final confrontation not as a battle of power, but as a test of endurance and devotion. The 15th paragraph, therefore, represents both the nadir of despair and the fragile seed of hope that will carry the story into its climactic resolution. By the 16th stage of The Conjuring, Last Rites, the film transitions from despair into preparation for what feels like the final stand, though this preparation is soaked in fatalism rather than optimism. The Warrens and the remaining priests gather in the desecrated parish, aware that the entity's grip has reached a point of no return. The church itself has become a theater of contradictions, holy yet unholy, sacred yet defiled. Every corner bears signs of corruption. Crucifixes hang upside down, statues are cracked and weeping ichor, and the once white altar cloth is stained black with soot and blood. Yet in this very space, the survivors prepare for the confrontation that could determine not victory but survival. The atmosphere is thick with resignation, as though everyone involved understands that what is about to unfold will not end with triumph but with sacrifice. Lorraine, more than anyone, embodies this tension. Her visions have left her frail, trembling, and hollow-eyed, yet they have also provided her with insights no one else possesses. She understands now that the demon cannot simply be expelled. It must be confronted as an idea, as a force that thrives on corruption. In one of her quietest yet most haunting lines, she whispers to Ed, "It doesn't want to kill us, it wants to change us." This realization reframes the coming battle. The goal is not to survive with bodies intact, but to endure without surrendering souls. The stakes, therefore, are not life versus death, but purity versus corruption. For Lorraine, this is far more terrifying because death feels like release while corruption feels eternal. Ed, despite his failing health, refuses to step aside. His determination to protect Lorraine becomes both his strength and his weakness. In a heart-wrenching scene, he insists on participating in the final ritual, even as his body trembles and his voice falters. Lorraine pleads with him to rest, but he shakes his head, declaring, "If this is our last fight, then it's mine too." His stubbornness is deeply human, a mixture of love, pride, and fear of uselessness. The audience is torn between admiration and dread, knowing that his frailty could doom him, but also understanding that without him, Lorraine would falter. Their bond, frayed but unbroken, becomes the fragile thread on which the entire confrontation rests. The priests, too, are fractured. Some have fled, unable to endure further torment, leaving only a small handful willing to stay. Those who remain are exhausted, their faith bruised, and their confidence shattered. Yet their willingness to endure despite this makes them compelling figures, symbols of perseverance even in the face of futility. In one striking moment, an elderly priest admits, "I no longer know if God hears me, but I will speak his words anyway." This confession is both heartbreaking and inspiring, encapsulating the paradox of faith under siege. Belief is strongest when it persists despite silence. These priests, though powerless in ritual terms, embody the endurance that the Warrens will need in the final battle. Cinematically, the 16th stage emphasizes ritualistic preparation with grim realism. The camera lingers on close-ups of trembling hands placing candles, worn faces whispering prayers, and Ed and Lorraine clutching each other in silence. Unlike earlier rituals that were adorned with grandeur, holy water splashing, Latin chants echoing, this preparation is stripped bare. There is no confidence, only desperation. The lighting is dim, the church lit by sparse flickering candles, casting deep shadows that suggest unseen presences lurking in every corner. The soundtrack is subdued, filled with low, rumbling tones that create a constant sense of unease. The effect is to make the audience feel as though they are not witnessing a confident ritual but a vigil, a farewell, a gathering before the inevitable. Lorraine's inner turmoil is at the forefront of this stage. She confesses to Ed that she fears not death, but becoming the demon's vessel. Vain. Her visions have shown her flashes of herself chanting in a distorted voice, leading a congregation into darkness. This possibility horrifies her more than any threat of physical harm. Ed, though shaken, reassures her with words that echo the core of their relationship. "As long as I'm here, you are you." His reassurance, though heartfelt, rings fragile, as though both he and Lorraine know it may not be enough. This moment is devastating because it highlights the limits of love in the face of supernatural corruption. Love can anchor, but it cannot always shield. The parishioners who remain are hollow shells of their former selves. Mothers clutch children silently. Men sharpen makeshift weapons not against the demon but against each other, fearful of betrayal. The church feels less like a sanctuary and more like a bunker, filled with people awaiting an apocalypse they cannot prevent. This human disintegration is as terrifying as the supernatural threat, reminding viewers that evil rarely needs to act directly when fear itself can hollow out entire communities. By the end of this stage, the atmosphere is set for the climax. The survivors sit in near silence, the Warrens clutching hands, the priests whispering prayers that may or may not be heard, and the parishioners staring blankly into the dark. The demon has not yet appeared, but its presence suffuses every frame. The 16th paragraph thus represents the calm before the storm, the quiet, trembling breath before the final descent into chaos. It is not a preparation for victory, but a preparation for sacrifice, and the audience feels this weight deeply, knowing that whatever comes next will change the Warrens forever. By the 17th stage of The Conjuring, Last Rites, the film unleashes its long-anticipated confrontation between the Warrens and the entity that has poisoned the parish. The buildup of dread, isolation, and psychological collapse erupts into a storm of supernatural force. The church, which had been a smoldering ruin of faith, becomes the battlefield upon which the final reckoning unfolds. From the moment the confrontation begins, it is clear that this is no ordinary exorcism. This is a war of wills, a direct clash between love and corruption, endurance and despair. What makes this stage so harrowing is that it does not promise victory. Every frame reinforces the possibility that the Warrens may not emerge intact. The entity manifests in a form that is both physical and symbolic. It does not appear as a single monstrous body, but as a swirling amalgam of the faceless figures that had haunted Lorraine's visions. They crowd the church, filling the pews, lining the aisles, pressing close to the altar, their blank faces reflecting faint shifting impressions of eyes and mouths. When they speak, it is in a cacophony of overlapping voices, a chorus of despair that seems to shake the very air. Lorraine realizes in horror that this is not simply an illusion. The entity is composed of fragments of corrupted souls, perhaps spanning centuries. Its strength lies not in claws or teeth, but in its ability to corrupt, absorb, and replicate. The church is not just haunted, it has become a vessel for this collective nightmare. Lorraine steps forward, trembling but resolute. Her role is no longer to banish the demon with ritual, but to confront it with the truth of her visions. She shouts into the cacophony, demanding that it reveal its true form. For a moment, the figures falter, their chorus breaking into dissonance. Then from within the swirling mass, a single towering figure emerges, its face still blurred, but its presence immense. This is the entity's core, its attempt to consolidate into something Lorraine and Ed can comprehend. The transformation is horrifying not because of gore, but because of recognition. The face that begins to emerge resembles Ed's. Lorraine realizes with dawning horror that the entity is not merely attacking them, but attempting to overwrite them to become them. Ed is dragged into the confrontation against his will, his frail body trembling under the weight of supernatural assault. The entity whispers through the faceless figures, taunting him with visions of his death, of Lorraine alone and broken, of his legacy erased. At one point, the ground splits open beneath him, revealing a pit filled with countless skeletal hands reaching upward, clawing at his ankles. Lorraine screams, rushing to him, but the entity pulls her back with visions of her own corruption. It forces her to watch herself leading rituals of blasphemy, her voice twisted, her eyes blackened. The terror here is not physical, but existential, the fear of losing one's identity, of becoming the very evil one fights against. The priests attempt to intervene, chanting in Latin, raising crucifixes, splashing holy water. But their efforts fall flat, swallowed by the sheer scale of the entity's presence. The holy water evaporates before it touches the ground. Crucifixes twist into grotesque shapes. The chanting is drowned out by the entity's chorus, which grows louder, mocking the prayers with distorted echoes. This impotence is devastating, underscoring that the traditional weapons of faith are useless against something that feeds on faith's corruption. For the priests, it is not just failure but annihilation of their very purpose. The parishioners who remain descend into hysteria. Some scream and flee into the night, only to be consumed by shadows outside. Others collapse into sobs, rocking back and forth as though already broken. A few disturbingly begin to join the entity's chorus, their voices blending seamlessly with the faceless figures. This chilling detail reinforces the film's central theme. Evil thrives not through brute force but through willing surrender, through the small cracks in faith that widen into open doors. Lorraine's turning point comes when she refuses to accept the entity's narrative. Instead of chanting prayers or invoking God directly, she clings to Ed, gripping his hand tightly as she declares her love for him aloud. "You are not me. You are not him. You are nothing without us." She screams at the faceless mass. For a brief, breathtaking moment, the entity recoils, the faceless figures flickering and distorting. The confrontation becomes less about exorcism and more about defiance, the insistence that love and identity cannot be erased. This is not a triumphant reversal, but a desperate act of resistance, a refusal to give in even when victory seems impossible. Cinematically, this stage is the most visually overwhelming. The church shakes violently, candles explode into showers of sparks, and shadows stretch across walls like living things. The sound design crescendos into near unbearable intensity, voices overlapping, wood splintering, wind howling through shattered windows. Yet within this chaos, the camera often returns to the Warrens' clasped hands, grounding the spectacle in intimacy. No matter how apocalyptic the visuals become, the emotional heart remains focused on this single gesture of connection. By the end of the 17th stage, the confrontation is at a stalemate. The entity has revealed its power, the priests are powerless, the parish is shattered, and the Warrens are on the brink of collapse. Yet they have not surrendered. Their defiance, fragile though it is, has created the faintest crack in the entity's dominance. It is not victory, but it is resistance. And in a film that has consistently emphasized corruption over destruction, this resistance feels monumental. The stage closes with the church bathed in flickering candlelight, the Warrens standing together, their voices drowned out by the entity's chorus, but their presence unbroken. The audience knows the climax is near, but the outcome remains terrifyingly uncertain. Ted, already struggling with his health, now finds himself burdened with the responsibility of grounding Lorraine in reality. He reassures her constantly, reminding her what is real and what is not. Yet his reassurances are undercut by his own vulnerability. Each episode drains him further, and his chest pains grow more frequent and severe. In one particularly painful scene, Ed collapses while attempting to comfort Lorraine, clutching his heart and gasping for air. Lorraine, torn between her fear of losing him and her terror of the encroaching visions, sobs as she cradles him, begging him not to leave her. The emotional weight of this moment is immense because it underscores the cruel double bind they face. In order to resist the demon, they must support each other, but in doing so, they expose their greatest weaknesses to further exploitation. The parish, meanwhile, is spiraling out of control. The division among parishioners has reached a breaking point. The faction convinced that the Warrens have brought damnation to their community becomes violent, storming into the church during one of Lorraine's attempts at meditation and demanding that she be removed. They accuse her of consorting with evil, pointing to her visions as proof that she has been compromised. The confrontation nearly turns into a riot before one of the priests intervenes, standing between Lorraine and the angry mob. This scene is chilling because it demonstrates how fear transforms faith into hatred, turning neighbors against one another in the name of survival. The demon, without lifting a finger, has succeeded in corrupting the parish's unity. From a cinematic standpoint, this stage is notable for its claustrophobic tension. The camera work becomes increasingly unstable, often employing handheld shots that shake slightly, as if reflecting the character's crumbling grip on reality. Hallways appear narrower, ceilings lower, and spaces more confined, creating a sense of entrapment. Lighting, too, becomes starker, bright in some moments to the point of sterility, then plunging into near complete darkness without warning. This visual inconsistency mirrors the instability of the Warrens' psychological states, making the audience feel as though they are trapped in the same cycle of fear and doubt. Lorraine's struggle escalates when she begins to hear a new voice within her visions. Unlike the faceless chorus, this voice is intimate, gentle, and devastatingly familiar. It is Edie's. During one late-night encounter, she awakens to find a faceless figure at the foot of her bed. As she trembles, the figure tilts its head and whispers in Ed's voice, "Lorraine, let me in." She screams, waking the real Ed, who rushes to her side, bewildered by her terror. This cruel mimicry devastates her because it shows that the demon has learned to weaponize not just her love, but her trust in the most intimate way possible. The idea that she can no longer trust the sound of her husband's voice is perhaps the most psychologically damaging blow she could endure. The priests assisting the Warrens attempt to rally the parish with renewed rituals, but these efforts fall flat. Each attempt at prayer is interrupted by strange phenomena. Candles extinguish themselves, statues weep blood, and the organ plays discordant notes without anyone touching it. These disturbances, though not overtly violent, sap the courage of the congregation. Faith, once a weapon, has become a liability. Every prayer risks triggering new horrors. The Warrens recognize the pattern. The demon is not trying to destroy the parish outright, but to render it spiritually hollow, a sanctuary devoid of belief. If it succeeds, the church will no longer be a house of God, but a monument to despair. Lorraine, despite her fear, resolves to continue pushing forward. She believes that the faceless figures are fragments of the demon's essence, manifestations of its attempt to erode her sense of self. If she can endure their presence without surrendering, she might weaken the demon further. But this determination is double-edged. It demands that she continually expose herself to trauma, risking her sanity in the process. Ed supports her decision outwardly, but secretly fears that he is watching the woman he loves unravel. His inner conflict adds a layer of tragedy, because his love compels him to stand by her even as he suspects that doing so may doom them both. By the end of this stage, the stakes feel higher than ever. The parish is on the verge of collapse, Lorraine is teetering on the edge of madness, and Ed's health is deteriorating rapidly. The demon, though rarely seen directly, looms over every scene, its influence growing stronger not through physical manifestations but through the unraveling of human relationships, trust, and sanity. The 13th paragraph thus cements the sense that the story is no longer about exorcism in the traditional sense. It is about survival against an adversary that thrives not on possession, but on the corrosion of love, faith, and identity. By the 18th stage of The Conjuring, Last Rites, the narrative escalates to what feels like an apocalyptic fever pitch. The confrontation between the Warrens and the entity enters its most brutal and devastating phase, where the distinction between physical and spiritual collapse blurs entirely. The church, already desecrated, begins to disintegrate around them as though unable to contain the magnitude of the battle unfolding within its walls. Wooden beams crack and fall, stained glass windows shatter inward, and the air is filled with choking dust and smoke. It is not just a fight, it is a collapse, an unraveling of both sacred space and spiritual order. For the audience, the sense of inevitability is overwhelming. This is not simply a climax but an ending, the point where everything must break before anything can be reborn. The entity intensifies its assault by directly targeting the Warrens' deepest vulnerabilities. Lorraine is forced to watch visions of Edie lying dead in her arms over and over again, each more gruesome than the last. Sometimes he is crushed beneath debris, sometimes consumed by flames, sometimes torn apart by unseen hands. Each time she screams and clings to him, only for the vision to dissolve into smoke. These repeated torments threaten to break her resolve, convincing her that resistance is futile, that every outcome leads to the same result, loss. Ed, meanwhile, is subjected to visions of Lorraine possessed, her voice twisted, her hands dripping with blood as she leads others in blasphemous rites. For Edie, the idea of Lorraine's corruption is worse than his own death, and the entity exploits this mercilessly. The priests attempt one final coordinated ritual, gathering what little strength they have left. They circle the Warrens, chanting in unison, holding their battered crucifixes aloft. For a brief moment, the entity recoils, the faceless figures flickering uncertainly. Hope surges, both for the characters and the audience, but then the entity responds with overwhelming fury. Crucifixes burst into flames, the priests are thrown violently across the church, and one is dragged screaming into the shadows, never to reappear. This devastating moment shatters any illusion of ritualistic power, reinforcing the film's message that tradition and formula cannot defeat corruption that feeds on despair. The parishioners fare even worse. Many collapse into unconsciousness from sheer terror, while others begin chanting along with the entity's chorus, their voices blending with the faceless figures. This horrifying transformation shows that the demon's ultimate victory is not destruction, but conversion, turning the faithful into instruments of despair. The audience is forced to confront the chilling possibility that salvation is not about preserving everyone, but about preserving even one soul against corruption. The sheer bleakness of this realization deepens the terror far more than gore ever could. Lorraine's breaking point comes in a scene of unbearable tension. The entity confronts her with the ultimate vision: Ed's corpse at her feet, her own hands covered in blood, her reflection in the shattered glass revealing blackened eyes and a twisted smile. The vision whispers, "This is who you are." For a moment, she almost believes it. She begins to collapse, her body shaking, her voice faltering as though surrendering. The audience, too, feels the weight of inevitability pressing down, the sense that Lorraine's resistance has finally crumbled. And then, in a desperate act of defiance, Ed intervenes. Despite his frailty, despite his failing heart, he pulls Lorraine back into his arms and shouts into the void, "You cannot have her. You cannot have us." His voice, trembling yet resolute, cuts through the cacophony of the entity's chorus. Oh. For the first time, the faceless figures pause. The entity recoils, its towering form flickering and distorting. This is not because of ritual, not because of holy water, but because of love, a raw human force that cannot be corrupted or replicated. The film crystallizes its central theme here, that love, though fragile, is the only weapon against corruption. Cinematically, the 18th stage is overwhelming in scope. The church seems to collapse in slow motion, debris raining down as the camera swirls around the Warrens in chaotic, handheld movements. The sound design is deafening, filled with overlapping screams, thunderous cracks, and the relentless chorus of the entity. And yet, amidst this chaos, moments of silence punctuate the action. Close-ups of Lorraine's trembling face, Ed's hand clutching hers, the two of them whispering to each other, even as the world falls apart around them. These intimate touches ground the apocalyptic spectacle in humanity, reminding the audience that the true battle is not cosmic but personal. By the close of this stage, the church is in ruins, the priests incapacitated, the parishioners either unconscious or corrupted. The entity looms larger than ever, yet the Warrens remain standing, battered but unbroken. Their act of defiance has not destroyed the demon, but it has cracked its veneer of inevitability. For the first time, the entity falters, its chorus fractured, its faceless figures flickering uncertainly. The 18th paragraph, therefore, represents the turning point. Not victory, but resistance strong enough to wound. The audience is left trembling, knowing the climax is imminent, uncertain whether the Warrens' fragile defiance will be enough to survive what comes next. By the 19th stage of The Conjuring, Last Rites, the confrontation reaches its most harrowing intensity, a crucible where the Warrens' love is tested against the full fury of the entity. The church, now half-collapsed, has become an unrecognizable battlefield. Walls cracked open to reveal gaping voids, the altar shattered into fragments, and smoke rising from smoldering pews. The faceless figures that make up the entity no longer simply stand silently. They press forward, enclosing Ed and Lorraine in a suffocating circle. Each blank visage now bears faint flickers of recognition, as though the demon is attempting to overwrite their identities with echoes of countless corrupted souls. The sense of inevitability weighs heavier than ever, as if the Warrens are staring into a void that has swallowed countless before them and may soon consume them as well. Lorraine is the first to act, but her strength is faltering. Her visions assault her with relentless cruelty. Scenes of Ed's death, of her own corruption, of the world beyond the parish consumed by shadow. At one point she falls to her knees, clutching her head and screaming, her psychic gift overwhelmed by the sheer volume of despair flooding through her. The entity seizes this moment, speaking directly into her mind with a voice that is both her own and Ed's, whispering, "Join us. End the suffering. You are always ours." This psychological assault is more terrifying than any physical threat, because it suggests that Lorraine's identity is already unraveling. Ed, trembling and breathless, refuses to let her collapse. He drags himself to her side, clutching her hand with all the strength his frail body can muster. "A look at me," he pleads, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You are Lorraine Warren. You are my wife, and nothing can take that from us." His words, simple yet resolute, cut through the cacophony like a lifeline. Lorraine clings to them, her breathing slowing, her focus sharpening. For the audience, this moment is devastating in its intimacy. Love becomes not a sentimental idea, but a literal force of survival, a tether holding Lorraine back from the abyss. The entity, enraged by this resistance, unleashes its most violent assault yet. The ground heaves, cracks splitting across the floor like jagged scars. From these fissures, skeletal hands reach upward, clawing at the Warrens, pulling at their legs. Shadows twist into monstrous forms, darting across the walls with impossible speed. The faceless figures close and tighter, their chorus rising to a deafening pitch. The sheer sensory overload is overwhelming, a cinematic barrage that makes the audience feel as though they too are suffocating under the weight of corruption. The priests, barely conscious from earlier assaults, crawl toward the Warrens, attempting one final prayer. Their voices are weak, trembling, but their determination is unwavering. They chant not in Latin this time, but in plain, broken English, invoking God with words stripped of ritual. Protect them, keep them, hold them. These simple pleas, though feeble, carry a resonance that echoes through the chaos. For a fleeting moment, the faceless figures hesitate, flickering uncertainly as though reminded of something beyond corruption. The film suggests here that faith is not in formula or language, but in sincerity, in the raw cry of the soul. The parishioners, scattered and broken, contribute in their own fragile way. A child begins to hum a hymn his mother once sang, the soft melody rising above the cacophony. Others, inspired by his innocence, join in, their voices quivering but persistent. This small, imperfect chorus of humanity contrasts starkly with the entity's overwhelming roar. It is not loud, it is not polished, but it is defiance in its purest form, a refusal to surrender entirely. The juxtaposition of these fragile voices against the entity's deafening chorus becomes one of the film's most haunting images. Cinematically, the 19th stage pushes spectacle to its limit. The camera spins in dizzying circles, following the Warrens as they cling to each other amidst collapsing rubble and advancing figures. Flames flicker in unnatural colors, blue, green, black, casting eerie, shifting shadows. The sound design reaches its peak, layering screams, whispers, crashes, and hymns into an overwhelming storm of noise. Yet amidst this chaos, the camera often cuts to extreme close-ups of Ed and Lorraine's hands locked together, the sweat and blood on their skin glistening in candlelight. These intimate details remind viewers that the true battle is not cosmic but personal. The climax of this stage comes when Lorraine, strengthened by Ed's words, finally finds the courage to speak directly to the entity. Instead of invoking God or scripture, she declares, "We're nothing without what you steal. You are nothing without us." Her voice, trembling yet defiant, reverberates through the church. For the first time, the faceless figures falter en masse, their forms flickering violently. The entity recoils, its towering figure collapsing inward as though struck by something it cannot comprehend. Rejection. This moment does not destroy the demon, but it wounds it in a way no ritual ever could. By the end of the 19th stage, the church is a ruin, the survivors battered and broken, and the entity destabilized but not defeated. The Warrens stand together at the center, exhausted, trembling, yet unyielding. Their resistance has not banished the entity, but it has exposed its weakness, that it cannot create, only corrupt, and therefore cannot overcome love that refuses to break. The stage closes with the entity retreating slightly, the faceless figures flickering like dying embers, leaving the audience suspended in unbearable tension. The sense is clear, the final resolution is near, and it will demand the ultimate cost. The 20th and final stage of The Conjuring, Last Rites, brings the narrative to its devastating yet profoundly human conclusion. After nearly 2 hours of relentless dread, the film arrives not at a moment of triumphant victory, but at a resolution steeped in sacrifice, endurance, and ambiguity. The Warrens, battered and barely standing, face the entity one last time in the ruins of the parish. The faceless figures flicker around them like fading embers, their once deafening chorus now reduced to distorted murmurs. The entity, though weakened, remains present, a towering reminder that evil cannot be destroyed entirely. Instead, the question becomes whether it can be resisted long enough for love, faith, and humanity to endure. The climax pivots on the Warrens' choice. They realize that ritual will not save them. that prayers and relics cannot defeat something that thrives on corruption. Instead, they must offer themselves fully, risking everything to starve the entity of what it craves most, surrender. Lorraine clings to Ed, her voice trembling as she declares, "You will not have us." Ed, his body failing, joins her, adding, "We belong to each other." These words, though simple, carry the weight of everything they have endured across the series. The church trembles violently, shadows shrieking as if recoiling from their defiance. The entity surges in fury, attempting one final overwhelming assault, but the Warrens hold fast, their clasped hands a defiant beacon in the chaos. The priests, though powerless to banish the demon, contribute in their final act of solidarity. Bruised, bleeding, and broken, they kneel and begin to pray, not in formulaic Latin, but in raw, desperate pleas for mercy. Protect them. Preserve them. Their sincerity resonates not as a weapon against the entity, but as a chorus of support for the Warrens' defiance. The parishioners, too, join in, their once-fractured community uniting in whispered prayers, sobs, and hymns. This imperfect, fragile collective voice creates a counterbalance to the entity's corruption. For the first time, the church feels alive again, not as a sacred building, but as a gathering of human souls refusing to surrender. The entity, wounded but unyielding, lashes out with its final vision. It shows Lorraine a world where Ed is gone, where she is alone, where her gift has turned her into a vessel of corruption. For a moment, Lorraine falters, tears streaming down her face. But Ed pulls her close, whispering, "If that is the future, then let it come. Because I will fight for you in every shadow, in every silence, in every dark." His words embody the ultimate act of love, not the promise of survival, but the promise of unending resistance. This defiance cracks the entity's facade. Its faceless figures dissolve into smoke, its towering form collapsing inward until only silence remains. Yet the film refuses to offer a neat victory. The church is destroyed, the priests are dead or dying, the parishioners traumatized beyond measure. The entity has not been killed, merely forced back into silence. The Warrens themselves are shattered, Ed collapsing into Lorraine's arms, barely clinging to life, and Lorraine trembling as though her very soul has been scorched. Their survival is not triumph, but survival alone, purchased at unimaginable cost. The camera lingers on their broken figures, emphasizing that while evil has been resisted, it has not been vanquished. This choice underscores the film's central thesis, that corruption is eternal, and the only answer is eternal resistance. Cinematically, the final moments are hauntingly restrained. After the chaos of collapsing walls and screaming shadows, the soundtrack falls silent. The camera pulls back slowly, showing the ruined church bathed in dawn's faint light. Dust floats in the air, broken crucifixes lie scattered, and the Warrens huddle together amidst the wreckage. The stillness is almost unbearable, forcing the audience to sit with the devastation rather than rushing toward closure. In the distance, faint church bells toll, not triumphant, but mournful, as though marking both survival and loss. The epilogue reinforces this tone of bittersweet ambiguity. The surviving parishioners leave the ruins, their faces etched with trauma. Some clutch rosaries tightly, others cast them aside. The priests who remain bow their heads, unsure whether their faith has been strengthened or broken. For Lorraine and Ed, the aftermath is equally uncertain. Ed is rushed to a hospital, his condition precarious, while Lorraine sits silently by his side, staring at her hands as though still feeling the weight of the faceless figures. The camera does not grant her peace. Instead, it lingers on her haunted expression, suggesting that the battle may be over, but the scars are permanent. The final shot mirrors the film's themes perfectly. As Ed drifts into unconsciousness, Lorraine whispers, "You're still with me." The camera pans upward, leaving the hospital room behind, moving into the night sky. For a moment, the stars shine brightly, but then a faint whisper echoes on the soundtrack. The voice of the entity, distorted but unmistakably present. It is not gone. It is not gone. It has merely retreated. The film ends here, abruptly, denying the audience the comfort of resolution. Instead, it leaves them with a chilling reminder. Corruption cannot be destroyed, only resisted. And resistance is both a triumph and a curse, demanding eternal vigilance. In conclusion, the 20th paragraph cements The Conjuring. Last Rites is both a terrifying horror film and a meditation on the nature of evil. Its refusal to provide catharsis distinguishes it from other entries in the franchise, grounding the spectacle in human fragility. The Warrens' survival is not victory but testimony to the endurance of love and faith in the face of inevitability. For audiences, the ending is devastating yet unforgettable, a final reminder that the true horror lies not in demons or possessions but in the endless, exhausting task of resisting corruption. It is a finale that lingers, echoing long after the credits roll.